Hello everyone. I am Iryna Ignatenko. Today we will continue to talk about such a topic, the history of Ukrainian physicality and sexuality.
From what age did marriages take place in Ukrainian traditional society?
Marriages were usually concluded from the period of puberty. Roughly, for girls, the onset of menstruation was a sign, that is, the menstrual cycle indicated that the girl could already prepare for marriage, lead a sexual life, and give birth to children. It was approximately when she was 15 to 16 years old, the girl had to get married by the age of 18. The same applied to boys.
Was the bride tested for virginity?
In a number of regions of Ukraine, such a rite as Komora was known. It consisted in the fact that late on Sunday evening in the territory of the young groom, while preparing the bride for the marriage bed, they checked whether she came to the husband's family as a virgin, or vice versa, not. It happened as follows: to the wedding songs sung by older women, mostly they were Shevchenko songs, the bride began to be examined, looked at her between her fingers, looked in her hair, if the bride did not hide sharp objects somewhere to imitate defloration. If no items were found, then a clean shirt was put on the girl and she and her fiancé were escorted to the pantry. Komora is such a former agricultural structure, where at other times various agricultural inventories, grain and so on were stored. There was shot through the mating bed, which consisted of sheaves of wheat, covered with sheets and rows on top. Young brides were escorted there and given no more than half an hour to perform their marital duties, solely so that they could perform the act of defloration. At this time, all the relatives, especially the relatives of the young man, were waiting for the result. Women from the groom's side, it could be mother, grandmother, and so on, approached, knocked, asked and wondered if they had finished yet. If the result was delayed, they could even open the door and go in and see what was happening. If there were blood stains on the shirt and sheet, then these things were taken out and publicly shown to everyone. Sometimes they could be hung on a pole and carried around the village. That is, it was considered a great pride among the people. They glorified the girl, her family, the mother for raising such a daughter, and so on. If there was no evidence, then the wedding took place according to a completely different scenario. Such a girl could be beaten, humiliated and subjected to all kinds of atrocities, for example, putting a yoke on her, which was usually put on cattle. In this way she was humiliated because she did not keep her virginity, that she was intimate with men, fornicated and so on. As for the bridegroom, that is, the man, his role was quite passive, that is, he simply had to perform what was required of him. This is the act of defloration. If for certain reasons, perhaps psychological or physiological, he could not do this, then he sat on the bench, so to speak, and another player entered the game. He was, as a rule, an older friend of the groom. He was of the same family as the bridegroom, that is, it was a close blood relative of the bridegroom who was to perform this act of defloration. This custom may indicate that the collective and the family were the main ones and ruled over individuality, i.e., it did not matter here what emotions and feelings young people had towards each other, it did not matter whether they liked it or not. The family demanded evidence of virginity, and if the groom could not do what was expected of him, then another man acted in his place and performed this function. That is, it can be said that maiden virginity did not belong only to the girl herself and her lawful husband, but it belonged to the family and the family, which themselves made decisions, in what way to acquire it, either naturally or with the help of another man. There is even such information that sometimes, that they could take away innocence even with their fingers.
What were the ideas about the correct sexual life in marriage?
While married, the couple also had to follow certain recommendations and warnings. In particular, certain taboos were imposed on the couple. The couple had to refrain from intimate relations. Primarily this concerned 4 annual fasts. and also on Wednesday and Friday, which were fasting days. It was also necessary to refrain from sex during major calendar holidays, as well as memorial days. What was it connected with? First of all, with the belief that, on the one hand, such days are special and holy, and on the other hand, at this time, the boundaries between our visible world and the mythological afterlife, where spirits and souls live, are blurred. Therefore, at this time, one should think more about the spiritual, pray, remember, but it depends on what the situation is. Instead, on the one hand, it was considered a sin, on the other hand, children who were conceived during this period will have some stain or mark of another world on them to some extent. That is, any, for example, physical defects, visible birthmarks, psychological and physiological features of a child were precisely interpreted by popular culture as a punishment for parents for not observing sexual and spiritual rules in such days. It was also necessary to refrain from sex before a long journey or before important agricultural work, in particular before starting the construction of a house, or before hunting, before fishing. For women, if they began to prepare dishes that were considered to some extent special or ritualistic, such as baking a loaf or baking bread and so on. Because the attitude to sex, on the one hand, was quite understandable, because sex was considered a normal, natural relationship, as a result of which children are born. On the other hand, sex was seen as something sinful, diabolical to a certain extent, so in certain periods, on certain days and before starting certain works, one should abstain in order not to become polluted in this way and to be morally clean. For traditional Ukrainian culture, clear age limits were known, when it was already considered indecent to engage in sex. It is worth mentioning both the physiological and social limits that existed in Ukrainian society. Physiologically, this is when a woman has already reached menopause. It was believed that there was no need to simply have sex, because a woman can no longer get pregnant, because childbirth was considered the main purpose of sex. Such things as desire, sexual pleasure or orgasm and similar things were not considered by popular culture. Accordingly, even just sleeping together for grandfather and grandmother was already indecent. Roughly speaking, they need to sleep separately, for example, someone on the stove and someone in bed. It was considered shameful for old men to sleep together. Another moment, when a married couple had grandchildren, that is, when their children got married, their children were married, their children gave birth to children, respectively, the husband and wife became grandfather and grandmother, that is, it was considered indecent for them to become parents again. Folk culture oriented the married couple to the transfer of experience and wisdom, certain practical skills. It was believed that the younger generation, in particular their children, had to engage in sex and, accordingly, the continuation of the family, but on the other hand, folk culture already imposed the requirements on the older generation. If a couple had a child, for example, I personally recorded during the expedition such a mention that a woman gave birth to a child at the age of 58. Of course there were such cases. It is obvious that no one controlled people. If they wanted, they had sex. The society's attitude towards this was, on the one hand, condescending, but mostly mocking, that is, they could mock, make fun of the fact that the elderly and older people cannot forget this pleasure of life. But, usually, such children grew up with other children, with their mother's grandchildren. In fact, the family continued to live in unity, but again, these were considered more undesirable cases, which indicated that the couple could not calm down, did not control their certain emotions, feelings and desires. I want to emphasize that the popular culture considered these cases no longer necessary, because the possibility of giving birth to children to elderly people had already been stopped.
Were methods of contraception and artificial termination of pregnancy used?
Until recently, safe and reliable contraception simply did not exist. Of course, Women tried to regulate pregnancy in different ways, but these methods now seem completely random, that is, you are either lucky or, on the contrary, unlucky. Conditionally, such methods are divided into two types. The first method is the use of decoctions from various herbs. These are tinctures. It could also be the use of magical actions and magical techniques with the belief that it can work. Well, for example, women believe that certain information and a certain biological code, the number of children a woman can give birth to, is programmed precisely in her menstrual blood, so she believed that various manipulations with menstrual blood, or, for example, a shirt on which there are stains from this blood, they can protect her from the onset of a new pregnancy. Therefore, in particular, if such a shirt was washed, water was poured on the fire, because they believed that the children in the womb would burn. After the birth of a child, when the placenta left the female body, women could bury it under the threshold or under a fruit tree. Women who did not want to have more children could take this placenta and feed it to animals, such as pigs. They could also cut the placenta somewhere, because it was believed that after that a woman would never get pregnant again. Here are such examples of using magic with a belief that it can in some way help not to get pregnant. Regarding the use of herbs and some tinctures, it can be said that people in particular believe that if you take onion husks and drink a very strong decoction made from it, it will help a woman to cause bleeding if she was already pregnant in the early stages. Motherwort infusion was attributed the same properties. In fact, reliable contraception did not exist in those days. We can say that women invented it, that is, it was all at the level of superstitions and magic. If we talk about the use of unfinished sexual intercourse, then there was also a taboo here. The folk culture scared that if the sperm was released to the side, that is, not into a woman, not into a woman's vagina, then it was considered a very big sin. God will surely punish for it, in particular, that from this man's seed will be born devils who will persecute and do all kinds of mischief. That is, there were a lot of moral worldview religious things that kept people, in particular women, from using contraception. But after all, it was on the one hand, and on the other hand, reliable contraception still did not exist at that time. If women resorted to abortions, of course, they cannot be called abortions, but they were most likely terminations of pregnancy by absolutely barbaric methods, that is, women who already had many children, who may have lived in poverty or did not want to have more children. We know some information that women could insert various sharp objects into the vagina, in particular, a spindle or a goose feather and something similar. Of course, such practices led to the fact that the fetus died, but with this fetus, most likely, the woman also died, because bleeding, fever and inflammation and similar diseases of the body appeared. In fact, it ended in death. I myself received information from my informant, a woman of an elderly age. Her mother died in this way, thereby leaving 8 children orphans. That is, there are many cases when women from Ukrainian villages experience such misfortune. Moreover, in those days there was a moral and religious belief that a woman who resorted to such an act became a sinner. The people called such women a child killer and believed that she would face a very terrible punishment that would await her in the afterlife. Therefore, it can be said that women had no opportunities and no leverage to regulate their pregnancy at the time they lived. It can be assumed that a married couple could agree on this issue among themselves, if the man agreed, as I will say now, to have sexual intercourse, but not to finish it to the end, that is, to interrupt it, and accordingly, the sperm did not enter the woman. In this way, the couple tried to avoid contraception. But again, popular culture controlled and tabooed it. It can also be said that if the couple had everything, for example, 2 or 3 children, then there were rumors that the man and woman were fooling God, that is, they were living wrongly. They could even say that they were playing Praitulu. Accordingly, for the fact that they performed such an incomplete sexual act, they were condemned, because sex and intimate life for a married couple was allowed exclusively in order for the human race to multiply for the birth of children. That is, the issue of sexual pleasure, orgasms in traditional Ukrainian culture was silenced and not talked about.
How common was incest and sex between a father and his son's girlfriend?
In Ukrainian traditional culture, incest and sex of the head of the family with his son's partners were not common. This question interested researchers. Ivan Franko wrote and published an article. The fact is that Ukrainians lived in small patriarchal families, whose members considered it necessary to separate from their parents and start living their own lives. That is, after getting married and for some time, maybe up to a year, living with the partner's father and mother, the married young couple moved to their own house, where they managed and lived. The husband was the master, and the wife was the housewife. They had their own property, that is, they did not belong to their parents in any way. In fact, they did not live with them. And this is considered one of the main reasons why there was no incest. Snovstvo is an intimate cohabitation of a father-in-law with a daughter-in-law. There was no such thing. On the other hand, among Russians, for whom a large patriarchal family was characteristic, such shameful practices are known and often used. Russian ethnographers have written and published quite informative about it. The fact is that the father was considered the head of the family until he simply lost his physiological abilities, or psychological abilities to manage his family. Each of his sons, who married, brought to his house, to his household, his new wife. That is, it could be several families who all lived together, who already had their own children, but all of them were subordinated exclusively to the father. That is, the father had the money, the father had the key to the barn, the father had the last word. Accordingly, young and beautiful daughters-in-law also had to obey and do what their husband said, and obey and do what their father-in-law said. Obviously, constantly being in the same territory, in the same house, feeling only their own unlimited and complete power over their family, some of the husband-in-laws could actually force young daughters-in-law to enter into intimate relations with them. So that their sons did not notice this, they could even send them to earn some money to some other cities and villages, and then this disenfranchised daughter-in-law remained under the absolute power of her father-in-law. He could seduce her in different ways, both with kindness and force, and he could please or give her a lot of work. There were even cases when the father-in-law could sleep with several daughters-in-law. Again, this topic is well revealed in the writings and researches of famous Russian ethnographers. That is, for Ukrainians, this tradition actually does not exist, that is to say, because such cases have not been recorded, because the young family lived separately, it had a high social status in the community, it was no longer subordinate to its parents, that is, the family members had no real temptation. As for incest, one of the reasons why parents sent their children, boys and girls, to parties, was precisely because of the fear of incest, because in the summer people could sleep in different places, for example, on haystacks, or in a barn and similar places, then in winter it was necessary to sleep together. Everyone slept in the same house and did not sleep next to each other, for example, a mother and son, or a father and daughter, and there were many children. That is, in order not to create such uncomfortable situations, young people were usually sent to evening parties to sleep and spend the night together, but of course with the condition that they would restrain themselves in certain of their intimate and sexual desires and practices.
Did the practice of oral and anal sex spread in Ukraine?
Based on Ukrainian erotic folklore, or as it was called, Soromyce folklore, as well as on ethnographic records of surveys of Ukrainians, as they were carried out by Ukrainian ethnographers who lived in past centuries, we can actually say with confidence that Ukrainians knew and practiced various types and methods of sexual intercourse. That is, in addition to the classical, i.e. vaginal, there were also oral and anal. The fact is that intimate relationships were usually considered normal and natural, although there were certain restrictions, only married people could have a relationship. Accordingly, already in marriage, folk culture did not impose a taboo on these types of sex, again, because it was sung about, because it was talked about, and accordingly, we assume that it was based on one's own desires and needs, that is, such practices existed, they are known, and we can find out information about it by reading Ukrainian folklore.
Did prostitution exist in Ukrainian traditional society, and how widespread were venereal diseases?
Prostitution in our modern understanding is more of an urban phenomenon that was not characteristic of a traditional Ukrainian village, i.e., certain norms of morality and way of life of that Ukrainian society made it impossible to try to engage in prostitution, i.e., to give one's body to another person and receive money or some kind of material compensation for it. Instead, already at the beginning of the 20th century, the situation changes with the development of industrialization, plants and factories. With such changes, the mass migration of rural youth to the city begins and a freer and more relaxed life begins. And when girls could already flee from the villages to the cities to hide their unwanted or out-of-wedlock pregnancies, as a rule, prostitution began to develop and become more popular already then, because girls from the villages who moved to the cities mostly became prostitutes. These are the girls who lost their virginity before marriage, who became pregnant, who knew what fate awaited them in the village, and they could run away from this kind of village punishment to where no one knows them. But in reality, their fate was very tragic, that is, when they gave birth to a child, they could leave it somewhere or throw it to someone, for example, to a monastery or a church, and they had nowhere to go except to the so-called public houses. There they were provided with housing, provided food and work, which was very difficult and exhausting, but usually such women did not live to be 30 years old, because they mostly died from sexually transmitted diseases, in particular it was syphilis. The same applies to venereal diseases, because they were not characteristic of the closed traditional Ukrainian society, where there was no such mobility and migration. That is, young people who grew up and got married lived in their couples. They lived with one partner. Well, maybe if there were any betrayals, then there were not so many of these partners. Accordingly, the greater the mobility, the more the person has intimate partners, the more the risk of infection and contamination with venereal diseases increases. Therefore, venereal diseases begin to appear in the villages. This applies to those villages that were somewhere not far from the cities, that is, they experience some kind of mobility. And again, venereal diseases are more of a phenomenon for the city than for such a closed conservative Ukrainian village of the traditional period.
What was the attitude towards adultery?
Theoretically, adultery both on the part of the husband and on the part of the wife was usually condemned, but in practice it was not so clear-cut. The thing is that marriage was considered to be for life, and very, very serious reasons were needed if a couple wanted to divorce. Let's say, alcoholism or beating a woman or incompatibility of characters between partners and so on were not valid reasons. Accordingly, when there were conflicts between spouses, a man or a woman could cheat on each other. The male part of society had more opportunities to cheat on their partner. Why? Because men, unlike women, were more mobile, that is, they could go, for example, to different farms, that is, engage in various types of professions such as hunting, construction. They also went to fairs and so on, that is, they were more active and more mobile than women. At that time, women were mostly at home or in the fields, i.e., they took care of the house, children, and agriculture, so they had fewer temptations with whom men could, so to speak, sin. First of all, this category includes women who did not have husbands, that is, those who were single and did not have a partner. Who was that? They were the same pokraki, they were also young widows, they were unmarried women, they were women of soldiers, these were women whose husbands were taken into the army, that is, they lived alone and, accordingly, it can be assumed that some of them needed both male attention and male affection, as well as certain male household help, without which it was difficult for them to cope. And coming to help first once, then again, word for word, and it could end, of course, in an intimate relationship, either one time or multiple, that is, such a woman could actually be a lover for this man on some such permanent basis. The official wife of the man who cheated on her, of course, found out about it sooner or later, but she also did not have much leverage to somehow manage this situation. In general, popular culture recommended ignoring and not noticing this situation, not causing scandals to the husband, and such behavior and social strategy were considered wise, because it was not profitable for a woman, that is, an official wife, to lose her husband, because he was the master, the owner of the house, the father of children, and it was not profitable for him to go to another woman. And that is why there were cases, I myself recorded more than one such life and real story, when official wives knew about it and simply tried not to notice or pay attention to it, simply understanding that it would only worsen the situation, and those women, according to modern we call them mistresses, in principle, this situation was also beneficial to them. Of course, there were conflicts, fights and the like between women, but anyway, as a rule, it suited the man, so to speak, to live for two families. Sometimes it can be missed that intimate relationships, that is, betrayals occurred with the best man or with the best man. The fact is that the institution of nepotism in Ukrainian traditional culture was deeply rooted, and after baptizing a child, very close intimate relationships, contacts, help, etc. took place between the spouses. That is, it was considered inadmissible and unacceptable for some stranger's man to visit another woman, and to visit the best man's house was considered quite normal. And you can assume and actually fantasize that after coming once, then coming a second time, and there is no best man and there is only his wife, even Ukrainian songs, that is, Ukrainian folklore also talks about this in such plots, so that later between people who communicate closely and often discussing some common topics, these people had emotional intimacy, then sexual attraction, and actually it could end in sex and other intimate relationships. But in contrast to previous practices of long cohabitation with a godmother or godfather, it began to become simply impossible, because it was considered a great sin and a great shame, and of course, as we can now say, there were no prospects for development in the relationship.
What are the characteristics of the situation of the unmarried?
The situation of unmarried people is the same as for men, that for women in Ukrainian traditional society was extremely low. It was believed that these people did not pass an important life stage, they did not create a family and did not create a family, they do not have children. That is, if these people were men, they were not invited to village community meetings, they were not consulted, women were also ignored and not invited to the women's collective, to perform a number of rituals. That is, believing that such a woman with her presence and participation in rituals will bring various misfortunes and so on. In addition, single people were endowed with certain demonic properties, that is, people believed that these people were prone to sorcery and witchcraft and other negative magic, it was believed that they were evil, that is, they should be avoided in various ways. Although in fact one should look at this situation differently, from another point of view it can be said that single women were unprotected, that is, they did not have, as they said then, a man who could stand up for them, and it can be assumed that to some extent these, in addition to such moral and psychological pressure, women also experienced physical pressure. That is, married men and unmarried men could court them in the same way, using physical force in the same way. There were even cases when the situation reached the point of rape, perfectly understanding that this woman would not go anywhere to complain, because even now there is a lot of talk about it when the victim is accused of having provoked the man, of speaking to him the wrong way or of being dressed the wrong way. That is, for a traditional Ukrainian village, a single woman, especially if she was young, beautiful and attractive, it could be very dangerous for her, because she could become the object of physical violence from men, including without any protection and without counting for his protection from the society of that time.
What was the attitude towards rape?
This topic itself, the topic of rape, was not studied or revealed by ethnographers, who were mostly men, in Ukrainian traditional society. That is, were there rapes? Who was the rapist? How did society deal with this rapist? Was society punishing him? Was the victim guilty? That is, it can be assumed that this problem, if it even existed, was kept silent, because this topic is uncomfortable, it is a topic that is better not discussed, not noticed, and so on. There is information that if a certain young man seduced a girl, and there were rumors that it was he who made her a child out of dishonor, then the village community could actually gather and go to his family, to his house, that is, to his parents and to him, to clarify this situation. They could even tie him to a post or beat him, and even do it in public, shame him and so on. That is, if it concerned the girl, then in this way, as if by putting pressure on him and his family, they made it so that he would get married. That is, it was considered that if the rapist or the man who dishonored the girl would marry her, that is, if they create a family and the child will be born in an official marriage, then in this way he seems to avoid punishment, so to speak, that is, he corrects himself. Yes, well, again, the question is whether this girl wanted to marry him, but society believed that she definitely wanted it. Of course, the guy could avoid this in any way, that is, say that I am not involved here, that in order to find out exactly, witnesses were needed, and so make various excuses, that is, such a question was considered very, very difficult. And also exactly, if we talk about the rape of adult women, single women, or young widows, coverings and so on, then witnesses were needed for this, and this topic was very intimate and delicate. Not every victim, not every the woman decided on this, and, moreover, realizing that most likely she would not be supported. That is, it can be assumed that all this was kept silent, that it was not spoken about, and in this way, of course, it also gave men a certain basis for behaving in this way in the future. But in Ukrainian ethnography and ethnology as a science, there are a number of topics that require detailed coverage, consideration and public discussion. Rape is one such topic.